Hello, everyone. My name is Adam Safron. I am a postdoctoral research fellow at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Studies. I am also a research fellow with the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University. Today, I'll be telling you about a model I've developed of sexual pleasure and really all pleasures, I believe, and ecstatic states via mechanisms of rhythmic entrainment. And I will also be discussing their potential implications for human connection and bonding. I thought of these ideas came to me a number of years ago, but I first published on them in 2016 in an article in Socioaffective Neuroscience and Psychology, which is open access and free to read online for anyone who's interested. The inspiration came when I was reading about actually epilepsy. And I learned about, I was reading about these epilepsies that would be triggered by rhythmic stimuli. So some people are vulnerable to flashing lights like a strobe light, and that could trigger seizures for them. Then I also read about an interesting case where someone would get spontaneous orgasms from brushing their teeth with an electric toothbrush. And then I was also reading about epilepsies associated with the auras, the feeling leading up and accompanying the seizures would be associated with these ecstatic or mystical states. Apparently, Dostoevsky experienced these, described these in his book, The Idiot. And that's Saint Teresa may have had something similar. And interestingly, also my father, he was a temporal lobe epileptic who would have music-related ecstatic states and frequent seizures. So from all of this, I started to wonder, well, could there be a common thread? Something about rhythms which are gateways to intense experience and pleasure. And so then I started to think that, yes, and I was focused mostly on the case of sexuality and wondering with respect to orgasm, what is it about rhythms that help people to experience sexual pleasure and possibly orgasm? And so I started thinking of an evolutionary account of this, and I believe there's a story here that's hundreds of millions of years old, maybe even more, at least hundreds of millions. But the basic idea is that there's a thread going through mating song, mating dances, and the mating act itself, where you're having this gating of whether or not things will proceed based on the abilities of animals to exhibit strong or precise rhythms, and that this may be an honest indicator of organismic fitness. And so this would be a good thing for gating the mating act. So let's see. Darwin had somewhat similar ideas, and let's see it in action. So as I was saying, I believe this is a very old story of the fundamental nature of rhythms and mating. But why? Well, rhythms are even more fundamental, if that's possible, than mating, in that nervous systems are inherently rhythmic. They have to be. Nervous systems of neurons are noisy, that they fire kind of oftentimes semi-randomly. In order to bring them together, especially if they're large, they have to learn to communicate in time together so that they can have coherent communication, so that activity of neurons can sum rather than decay. And so the syntax of the brain of nervous systems, it's inherently rhythmic. And so then the idea being that if you can display these rhythms, this is showing that you have a well-tuned nervous system and you're potentially a well-tuned organism and evolutionarily worthy of making it to the next generation. But with those fish, what exactly was going on there? What kind of mechanism is happening? So what I suggested is that what's happening there is describable in terms of a principle of entrainment. And so entrainment maybe was first published on by Christian Huygens, describing this odd kind of sympathy where when clocks were placed on a wall, they were found that over time they would just spontaneously come into sync. So somehow by exchanging vibrations through a wall, he noticed the clocks would spontaneously synchronize. And I can show you a little bit of that right here. So you see these metronomes, they're decoupled. They're sharing that beam. Maybe eventually they'd sync, but maybe not. But once you let them really start to couple, really start to exchange energy, then they come into sync with each other. And so this is a nearly ubiquitous principle in nature, the ability of order to emerge via this ability of dynamical systems to synchronize with each other. And so in the sexual domain, the idea is that people, as they're coupling, they're mechanically coming into synchrony, and that this is allowing nervous systems to become synchronized by virtue of the nervous systems coupling with the rhythmic activity. I'll explain a little bit more what I mean by this. But one metaphor you can think of is pushing on a swing. That's another way of thinking of entrainment. So in the model I developed, you would start with a less rhythmic or arrhythmic interaction, not particularly pleasurable or sensual. And then it acquires some sort of rhythmic nature. So now these rhythms, by pushing at the swing of your nervous system, would then cause your ongoing neural oscillations to be brought into alignment with these rhythms. And so now your brain is going more at that frequency. However, there's an interesting twist here, and that it's been observed that you're better able to attend to stimuli when they come in phase with your ongoing oscillations. So it seems that the default refresh rate of your consciousness is happening at alpha frequencies about 8 to 12 times a second, or at least the ability of your consciousness to sample from the environment. And so if I were to flash like a face, and it came at this upstate, at this period of synchrony, and if it comes at the alpha upstate, you'll be more likely to detect it or make some sort of discrimination based on this. So intention is enhanced by when external stimuli or any stimuli are in a phasic alignment with your ongoing oscillations. But then there's another interesting twist, and that entrainment effects have been shown to be more powerful with greater attention. The more you attend to something, the more it can entrain you. And so this then could, I suggest, create a kind of positive feedback loop between your nervous system being entrained and then you being better able by rhythms, and then you being better able to attend to things at those rhythms. And with this positive feedback loop, if it goes on long enough, it will crowd out other more arrhythmic stimuli and allow you to have intense focus on whatever that rhythm is. And if that rhythm is pleasurable, you'll have intense focus and consciousness for those rhythmic stimuli, that rhythmic experience. And if you let this go on long enough and strongly enough, potentially you can surpass critical thresholds. And this could cause a few things, but one, it could crowd out things like self-monitoring, self-processes. So it could be associated with things like flow states, losing yourself in an experience, which itself would be pleasurable. But at the extreme, this could allow your brain to come in this highly synchronized state. If you get in this period, in this regime, you can have a high degree of communication across the brain, and that this could cause orgasm as a kind of quasi-epileptiform type process akin to a seizure. Turns out I'm not the first person to suggest this. Actually, Barry Komisaruk, he published on this first around 2011. And so when I read that, I was like, okay, maybe this works. So that's the basic model. You have this progression going of engagement with rhythmic stimuli, which entrain you, which lets you attend to them more deeply, which lets them entrain you more, and so on. And that this creates highly intense, focused experience, intense pleasure. And if you push this hard enough, it can bring the whole brain into a highly synchronized regime that can cause these flare-ups of activity, which some of them would be experienced as climax or orgasm. But this general story, I believe this isn't the case only for sexuality. I think this might be the case for all intense pleasures. I'm actually, in some ways, I'm not aware actually of a pleasure that isn't fundamentally rhythmic in its character. Eating, running, for some people, dancing, like the things people seek out the most, they tend to have this rhythmic quality: music, dance, and sex. And so yeah, the model is one of you become highly synchronized, and then communication can flow well, and then something happens and you ring the bell, and this quasi-epileptiform process would be orgasm or climax. And they're saying, Barry, I think 2011 suggested this, Komisaruk and Whipple. And so, but the pleasure, though, it's not just at the orgasm; it's throughout. And in this biased competition where rhythms can win out against less rhythmic thing and crowd out yourself, this would be, I think, a large part of what we should take into account to describe the phenomenology of sexual experience and maybe most intense pleasures. Crowding out of things that are less rhythmic, you associate with something like a flow state, this optimal engagement where just things are moving smoothly. You're completely engaged, and that itself would be pleasurable. There might be an additional element in that thing about cells is they sometimes suffer. They get into all sorts of problems. The world is bigger than cells. And if you crowd out this ability to reflect on yourself as this temporally extended thing that can get into trouble and is limited in all these ways, that itself could be a big part of the pleasure, losing yourself in the experience. That seems to be a lot of what people are seeking in various peak states, both losing and finding themselves. So more recently, I've been trying to extend this model to an interpersonal context. So at first, I wasn't sure it even worked, and so I was just saying, like, could the mechanism even work? So, like, how do I explain an individual being entrained with a rhythm? But the interesting thing is that if this rhythm is being created or co-created with two people, well, then they can come into sync with each other and they can become highly entrained together. And I think this might have important consequences. So the idea here would be that in this state of rhythmic engagement where this self-monitoring, this, right on time, your ability to metacognitively reflect on yourself, to extend yourself through time and think of all these things that aren't what's happening in the moment, when those get crowded out, you're basically your egoic selfhood. You go from the Jamesian me to an I, to just this experience. And under these conditions, someone else might be doing this too. And so you're both in this state of relaxed self boundaries, and you are synchronized mechanically and potentially neurally. And so if you're synchronized neurally, if your brain rhythms, probably definitely delta, maybe theta, and maybe as much as alpha, 8 to 12 times a second, unclear, but at least theta. So 3 to 7 times a second, sampling information from the environment. Well, if you're both generating actions and sampling at the same time, you have this very high bandwidth channel of communication between you. Just the way that neurons, by coming into alignment, communicate more, you, by being in alignment with someone else, that's a higher bandwidth channel for communication. And so this could create better conditions for shared emotional contagion. And so here are two people experiencing intense pleasure, with their self-monitoring reduced, and a high bandwidth channel of communication between them where they're likely sharing emotional states, little fluctuations of emotion, one person shared by the other and vice versa, and these very tight feedback loops. This, I think this might be a good amount of why it is that shared rhythms facilitate bonding, sexual and otherwise. Um, and if we throw on top of this experience, orgasm and getting, the brain's pharmacopoeia, you release that, and so you have enhanced metaplasticity. That'd be another means of bonding. So not only were you sharing in this kind of peak experience together, but now you've upped the gain on the things that would bake that into your neural circuits. I have doing okay on time, so I can go a little more speculative here. There's this experiment called the rubber hand illusion. Sometimes it's done with like a full body swap. But basically, if you take someone's hand and you hide it under a table, and then you put a fake hand above the table, and you stroke both the rubber hand and your concealed hand in synchrony, there's this interesting effect that happens where you start to feel that this rubber hand is part of your own body. And you can do this with your full body. You can this can also happen with full embodiment. But it seems that our body maps are surprisingly plastic. And this is part of, for instance, what allows them to be adaptive and grow and recover. And it also allows us to do things like use tools. It's been shown that tool use will, when you become good with it, like the master swordswoman, the sword will become part of her hand, part of her arm. It'll be incorporated into her body schema. And so very speculatively, the idea is that when people are sharing rhythms, they might actually potentially generate a kind of sense of co-embodiment. And so even their very minimal embodied selfhood could start to be somewhat porous. And this, again, might not even be just sex. It could be other shared rhythms and mother-infant bonding, people doing war chants together, all sorts of things. But the idea is that part of bonding could be a sense of co-selfhood and a sense of co-embodiment. So let's see. This might do it more justice than I can. We're gonna watch the whole thing together. We had to watch the whole thing together because I think that's still maybe the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, and maybe the most important. Um, I'm increasingly wondering, and I'm not the only one. Robin Dunbar has some interesting work in this direction regarding like why do we sing and why do we dance together. But I'm thinking that this is the secret of our success as a species. This is the fundamental part of what makes us human. our ability to share rhythms together, and through sharing rhythms deeply, being able to have a kind of flexible sense of identification, a flexible capacity for bonding and sharing emotions. This is what let us cooperate across scales. This is what lets the child learn from its parents. This is what lets individuals learn from each other and allowing uniquely human abilities for social learning and cumulative cultural evolution. I think it might all come down to potentially uniquely human capacities for shared rhythms. There's two interesting things that you wouldn't expect that humans are actually uniquely good at. We're very good at long distance running. Like I think we're the best. And we're also the best at having flexible and precise rhythms. And if you look at some of the genes associated with the evolution of humans, they're actually heavily involved in the cerebellum, which is exceedingly important for being able to do flexible and precise timing. So this story of how it is we have the deepest pleasures, I think it's the source of our deepest meanings on every level. And I think it's part of what makes us who we are and who we could be. So thank you for your time and attention. Please contact me if you have any questions. Take care.
Hi, welcome to Core Emotions, the 3-level brain, mind, and affective consciousness. I'm Dr. Nan Wise. I'm a psychotherapist, sex therapist, board-certified clinical hypnotherapist who went back to grad school at the tender age of 50 to become a behavioral neuroscience researcher with Barry Komisaruk, and I'm the author of Why Good Sex Matters, Understanding the Neuroscience of Pleasure for a Smarter, Happier, and More Purpose-Filled Life. So what we're going to talk about today is what is consciousness, what is affective consciousness, how the 3-level brain-mind works, the 7 core emotions and why they matter. And we'll talk about how affective disorders, psychiatric illness are rooted in imbalances in the core emotional systems, and that requires that we have a need for affective balances that include the body and the core emotions in therapy. My overarching goal, both in writing the book as well as doing the work that I'm doing, is to educate researchers and clinicians about core emotions. So what is consciousness? We're going to talk about what Jaak Panksepp wrote about in 2005. And for present purposes, consciousness refers to brain states that have an experiential field to them, envisioned as a multi-tiered process that needs to be viewed in evolutionary terms with multiple levels of emergence. So the primary process consciousness, which we're talking about as affective consciousness, reflects raw sensory perceptual feelings and internal motivational emotional experiences. Secondary consciousness reflects the capacity to have thoughts about experiences, especially how external events relate to internal events. Tertiary forms of consciousness are thoughts about thoughts and awareness of awareness, much of which is unique to humans and requires the neocortex that permits the linguistic symbolic transformation of simple thoughts and remembered experiences. So I do believe that we missed, oh no, that's fine. Okay. So what core emotions, affects, primary process, emotional arousals is consciousness. All of those terms are interchangeable. Affects are never unconscious. The qualia that arise from the very foundation of the conscious mind are these affects. The further we go into the depth of our affective foundations, our inside universe, the closer we come to our mental origins. Primal affects arise from the subcortex, where attentional, motivational, and emotional systems live. So we're talking now about how the three-level brain-mind works. So this is a view looking at the core emotions, the secondary processing, and the tertiary. So let's start with Panksepp's three levels of emotional experience that reflect three stages of evolutionary development. The first primary process core emotions are instinctual emotional responses, generating these raw core affects. Built in by evolution, these are largely subcortical. They're experienced vividly. Animals show fear, rage, attachment, and other emotional responses without the benefits of a fancy neocortex, which allows higher level reflections on the feelings. Even human babies born without a developed neocortex exhibit these core emotions. So these core emotions provide pleasure and pain signals for survival and thrival. Something perceived as pleasant, pleasurable. The mind, body, brain determines itself. It's safe, good for us, we approach. If these are deemed unpleasant, we automatically avoid. And this was designed to respond to basic physical needs, water, food, air, safety, and sleep. Higher brains don't have the time to think through satisfaction of needs. These things have to happen automatically. Raw feelings require no prior learning. Animals and humans don't need to be taught to fear pain or like pleasure. So now we're going to talk about the secondary processes of what I call the mid-level mind. These are built upon those core raw wired-in emotions and involve learning and memory. And these processes are largely upper limbic. In contrast to the core emotions, which are always experienced, secondary processes largely occur non-consciously. This is the territory of our behavioral and our emotional habits, which are stubbornly affixed, automatic, and below the hood of conscious awareness. Bear in mind that survival is predicated on learning that becomes automatic. The mind really needs to function as a habit-making machine. Contrast that with the higher effortful learning, which requires conscious attention, like when you first learn to drive or when you're solving a math equation or negotiating a business deal, where your higher level mind has to participate. The level 2 mid-level mind is nicely demonstrated by the classical conditioning. For example, in the case of the infamous and unfortunate HM, who's the patient who had bilateral removal of the hippocampal formation, who, if you gave him a shock, shaking his hand on day 1, day 2 wouldn't remember you, but wouldn't shake your hand. So he did not have a conscious memory of you, but he stored this mid-level association, classical conditioning, and would not shake your hand. So now we're moving up the food chain to the tertiary processes. These distinguish us from non-human animals. Humans and animals are very much the same at the bottom of the brain and very different at the top. So this includes our cognitive, executive functions, thoughts, and planning, allows awareness of experience where we can reflect on emotions as opposed to simply experiencing it. Ideally allows us to choose our paths and intentions in conjunction with working memory, which I think of as a conscious window on the world, equips us with the potential to regulate our actions and behaviors, providing the basement and mid-levels of brain mind are cooperating, which is the key reason why CBT is not always enough, cognitive behavior therapy. We always know what's on our mind, but we don't always know which mind we're in. So I'm going to stop for a moment, grab my dog because she wants to come in. Come on in, Jilly. Come on. Yeah, here we go. So this is Jilly. She has the same systems in the bottom of the brain. So she just came back from the vet. So we'll let her into hanging out with us. So as you can see, these core emotions, they go all the way up to, and they can infuse the neocortex. And when you have bad experiences in conditioning that can activate the core emotions, this can really result in a limbic hijacking. So embodied beings have more in common than we think. We're equipped with 7 core wired and emotional systems driving us to seek pleasure and avoid pain. And these core emotions serve as the primary emotional colors that drive or derail emotional, relational, and our sexual lives. And I wanted this slide because I really enjoyed this 3D heart thing. So moving on, the 7 wired and core emotions are circuits that can be activated by electrical or chemical stimulation. They were mapped out in animals by the work of Jaak Panksepp, who I believe is going to be a paradigm shifter. Animals like what feels good. They'll turn on the stimulation for that. And they don't like what doesn't feel good. They'll work to turn off the stimulation. So that's how you can communicate with animals. Temperament in the form of genetics can influence the basic tonality of our systems, and experience can upregulate or downregulate that wired in tone. So these are our embodied felt emotions. The defenses include fear, rage, and panic grief. These contribute to our survival. Our affiliation systems, care, play, lust, contribute to survival and thrival. We'll talk about the specialized seeking system, which is mobilizing us and acts in conjunction with all the other emotional systems, and that provides the seeking system our exuberance, exploration, motivation, and overall lust for life. And what that's associated is really more of the craving as opposed to satisfaction. We'll talk about that in a minute. Here we see the 7 systems, the key brain areas that have been delineated in the circuits by Jaak Panksepp and the key neuromodulators. And just for a moment, notice that each one of the systems, the periaqueductal gray, play a key role. And I'm going to mention some of that at the end of our talk. So seeking, that's mesolimbic dopamine system. It is mobilizing and acting in conjunction with all the other systems. Previously, we thought of those circuits as reward circuitry. Now we know it's more of a learning signal. So if you know about prediction error, when you expect a reward and it's not as good or it's better, it kind of gets our attention, and that's what learning is all about. If that's underactive, people will be lethargic, lack motivation, they procrastinate, they have often anhedonia, which is the inability to experience pleasure. It's a symptom as well as a cause of anxiety and depression and other kinds of mental health challenges. If the seeking system is overactive, the person will experience difficulty concentrating, craving, dissatisfaction, compulsive seeking behaviors that can forge addictive kinds of behavior. It can contribute to increased anhedonia. When it's balanced, we feel motivated, curious, engaged in our relationships and pursuits, able to access and activate other emotional systems as needed. The seeking system can get very hijacked by our devices in our high stimulation lifestyle. And for example, this way we use attention, continuous partial attention, where we're monitoring these devices, really can actually hijack the dopamine system and really flatten it in a way where we're not getting the proper bumps up for learning that we need. That's a longer conversation I cover in my book. So good therapy engages the client's seeking system to get curious and motivated about making changes. So in terms of the defensive systems, these are primarily about survival. So we're born with the innate fear response designed to protect us from danger. Researchers stumbled upon the fear circuitry while studying the self-stimulation of the reward pathway, which we'll call that the seeking one now. When the fear circuits were electrically tweaked, the animals looked and acted scared, low level electrical voltage, they froze, high voltage, they attempted to flee. Once conditioned, fear learning is set down in the mid-level mind. It's ferociously stubborn, For example, post-traumatic stress disorder is a good example of fear learning gone bad. And fear need be specific. Animals and humans experience free-floating anxiety. The symptoms aren't as dramatic, say, as PTSD or panic attacks, but free-floating anxiety is chronically stressful. And my Jilly is a bit of a hyper dog, but she's very sweet. She and I get along well. So the fear system, if it's overacted, it's so tweaked that it overreacts to threats. And it can be very depleting. And depleted by chronic stress, you can end up with generalized anxiety and decreased seeking. If it's underactive, people are not appropriately handling threats. They're denying danger, not learning from negative feedback and punishment. In fact, if you have damage to the amygdala, often that impairs proper fear responses. When in balance, fear, what makes sense to fear and only to the extent warranted. So walking along alone in a dark alley, it's scary. Upcoming work presentation, lesser but motivating levels of fear. Normal fear is meant to arouse the system just enough to warn and mobilize. So now we're going to go to the rage system. Pissed off. Rage is the raw substrate onto which anger, which is the more complex, cognitively infused emotion, is superimposed. The rage circuits get turned on automatically without learning when an animal or a person is pinned down, physically threatened, or their actions are restricted. Blocking an animal or person seeking behavior elicits rage. It's also associated with being hungry, thirsty, or even horny, essentially when you're frustrated in the process of seeking. When in balance, the rage system allows us to be appropriately able to take actions against threats and take appropriate stands towards a facilitating constructive resolution of conflicts. When overactive can cause hair-triggered temper, these road ragers, it can elicit high hostility, which is linked to coronary heart disease. When underactive, it can be suppressing defenses and people allow themselves to be bullied, not able to stand up for themselves, and can be manifested in like a victim or learned helplessness mentality. So now we're going to talk about panic and grief. Panic grief contributes to protecting life-sustaining bonds by keeping us close to significant relationships and resources that are critical to our physical survival and emotional thrival. This system is triggered when we lose a loved one, and this is the source of grief and the neural substrate of heartbreak. This works alongside the care system, both designed to ensure we seek companionship. The genetic predisposition in terms of temperament can affect reactivity of the system. Early childhood experiences can fundamentally shape the basic tonality of the panic grief system, either dialing up an anxious style or dialing down wired in reactivity. So panic grief wires us to stay connected to key relationships. When balanced, it enables us to attach and experience and tolerate a full range of feelings, including negative ones. I can't highlight that enough. People who can tolerate both positive and negative feelings are usually more what we think of as emotionally healthy. When overactive, we can end up with an anxious attachment style, difficulty separating, or actually panic disorder, and can be associated with experienced trauma. When underdeveloped, challenges in forming and sustaining close personal relationships are common, and someone can end up with an avoidant or dismissive type of attachment style. So we're going to move on to the affiliative systems, care, play, and lust. Care equals love. It runs on internal opioids, our brain's own internally produced painkillers. These neurochemicals are hardwired, so we attach to our young, our mates, our parents, our pets, our friends. The system provides natural feel-good chemicals that give sense of satisfaction and well-being. Contrast this to dopamine, which is craving and wanting, not necessarily liking and being satisfied. Yak says the physiology of motherhood is indeed the physiology of love. We might be seeking and craving a whole ton of stuff, but what we need is what evolution has wired us for: social contact, connection, and love, face to face, and if possible, flesh to flesh. So when in balance, we feel secure in relationships, we have reliable sources of support, able to love those closest without needing to control them. We're in touch with the capacity to self-love and practice self-care. We can have good boundaries and able to give without giving ourselves away. That's a very big issue for a lot of people. When overactive with the care system, we can have difficulty seeking enjoyment, fun, and sex, overly concerned with others to our own detriment. When underactive, we can lack the ability to nurture or form lasting social bonds, and we may end up withdrawing from loved ones and distancing from intimate and deep connections. So now we're going to move on to play. So play is a wired-in system, and it is the joyful occupation of all young mammals. Play is how we learn to explore, experiment with ourselves, each other, and the world, and learn how to socialize. It's how we rehearse skills needed to survive and thrive. It's how we learn skills, everything from hunting to foraging to courtship and mating. How we can get along with others, whether we're competing, cooperating, engaging, wooing, and mating, and how we learn who is safe and who should be avoided in such pursuits. So play is really important. So rat play is the primordial wired-in type onto which the others are layered. Rough and tumble, not rat play, but rough and tumble, good old-fashioned roughhousing that's gone out of style. The decrease in rat play is probably due to parents and schools viewing this behavior as dangerous or politically incorrect, letting kids roughhouse. Lacking rat playtime, kids' nervous systems are deprived of activities that shape and develop the finely tuned social brain so necessary for a balanced care panic continuum. Panksepp says that children deprived of physical play are at risk for development of hyperactive urges, distractibility, restlessness, easily misconstrued and misdiagnosed as symptoms of ADHD. So if you're unable to play as a child, you might be awkward in your social skills and have trouble managing stress as an adult. When in balance, you have a good sense of humor, you know how to relax, you have hobbies and interests, enjoy the zany aspects of life. If you're overactive in the play system, you might avoid settling down to the business of adulthood and committing to work and partner, looking for those more playful pursuits like a Peter Pan. Underactive, you might not be able to have fun. This is typical of most adults. Being overly self-conscious and controlling, not being able to relax in and out of the bedroom. So lust is about more than getting the genes into the gene pool. Sexual behaviors are kind of social glue. They forge important affiliations, cementing bonds, people to feed and protect us, transcendent experiences of connection. In order to get laid, even animals need rudimentary social skills, noticeably contributing to the development of social skills across species and having other benefits as well. So when balanced, we experience sexual desire and satisfaction when we have it, feel comfortable with our desire level, and open to exploring ways to experience pleasure. When overactive, we can have out of control sexual behavior, over-involvement with pornography, excessive masturbation, coupled with an imbalanced seeking system, impulsivity. When underactive, no interest in sex whatsoever. So why do we need affective balances in therapy? We have to attend to core emotions and how to work with embodied visceral emotions. We need to work with the autonomic nervous system, get us out of the sympathetic nervous system reactivity and more into the parasympathetic nervous system where we can relax and enjoy and play. No matter how hard we work our prefrontal cortexes, when we're triggered, we can't seem to restore our emotional balance. So we must learn to assess and treat imbalances in these defensive core systems that can lead to stress, anhedonia, and distress. And we need to train our clinicians and researchers to pay attention to core embodied emotions. And I like to say pleasure is not a luxury. It's important for a well-balanced emotional brain. In conclusion now, consciousness is best envisioned as a multi-tiered process that needs to be viewed in evolutionary terms with multiple levels of emergence. Psychology and medicine is resistance to the paradigm change, probably a big fear of anthropomorphism. Plus, if we think animals have core emotions, it changes our responsibility to them. And I think there's a lot of resistance. Research into affective consciousness may help unlock bigger questions about other levels of consciousness. And for example, we see here the periaqueductal gray, which is activated in orgasm, which is part of pain, blockage, and analgesia. The periaqueductal gray may play a role in affective consciousness, and according to Pinksip, has maps for all of the core affects. It is the PAG, as he says, that allows creatures to first cry out in distress and pleasure. All this is consistent with the postulate that our basic biological values, essential ingredients for a sense of self, are inextricably intertwined with the local properties of the PAG tissue. And here we see that PAG is an anatomic and functional interface between the forebrain and lower brainstem, plays a major role in integrating behavioral responses to internal and external stressors. It may also mediate food intake and reward processing, and has extensive reciprocal connections with brain circuits such as the prefrontal cortex, hypothalamus, amygdala, parabrachial nucleus, and the ventral tegmental area. So thank you so much. Thanks to Barry Komisaruk for helping me by letting me into graduate school at the age of 50, Rutgers for letting me do my PhD, and my research, and to all of you for listening. Thank you so much. And that's it. Bye.
Hello, everyone. I'm Barry Komisaruk from Rutgers University, and I'm presenting my paper entitled Pain and Genital Pleasure, Their Puzzling Similarities and Differences, in the Symposium session entitled Neuroscience of Sexuality and Consciousness, that's organized by Dr. Adam Safron. In my presentation, I will try to account for the quality of pleasure and sexual pleasure in particular, in terms of what we know about the function of neurons. As is well known, neurons can either be inactive or they can be active. Their activity indicated by the action potentials that they generate, with more action potentials firing per unit time, indicating higher degree of activity or excitation. And their neuronal activity can either excite or inhibit other neurons to which they project across the synapse, based on neurotransmitters that they release into the synapse. My basic premise is that neuronal excitation per se is essential to maintain the life of neurons, and we are designed to seek and obtain neuronal excitation. Neuronal excitation is reinforcing and rewarding. The more intense the excitation up to limits, the more pleasurable it is, reaching a peak at orgasm. And beyond such limits, intense neuronal excitation is aversive and painful. In our functional MRI studies with Nan Wise, we found that at orgasm, which most would agree is pleasurable, there is intense activation throughout the brain. The figure shows brain activity at times before orgasm on the top row, during orgasm in the middle row, and after orgasm in the bottom row. Brain activity is represented as a hot metal analog in which lowest activity is dark red, then higher activity is light red, orange, yellow, and white hot is the highest activity. The brain activation generates vigorous bodily activity that in turn intensifies proprioceptive sensory activity back to the brain. Shown in the next figure are some of the brain components that are specifically activated at orgasm and how they contribute to orgasm. Women pressed a button when their orgasm started. We electronically subtracted the 10 seconds of high arousal immediately before the button press from the first 10 seconds immediately after they press the button to indicate the orgasm. This shows which brain regions have higher activity during orgasm than even the high activity, high level of sexual arousal immediately before they go over into orgasm. So note that the amygdala stimulates the sympathetic system, which doubles the heart rate and blood pressure at orgasm. The anterior hypothalamus releases oxytocin, which stimulates uterine contractions at orgasm. The ventral tegmental area produces dopamine and releases it into the nucleus accumbens, the so-called pleasure center of the brain. Both of those brain components are strongly activated at orgasm. The dorsal-raphe is activated at orgasm. It activates the pain gate mechanism in the spinal cord, producing the potent pain blockage that occurs at orgasm. The hippocampus probably contributes to the erotic fantasy commonly experienced at orgasm, and the memory functions that are necessary for appreciating sensory stimulation. The anterior cingulate and insula receive sensory input from the body systems activated at orgasm. If we put all these together, they account for much of the phenomenon of orgasm. But then the question is, why do orgasms feel so good? I will try to make the case that neuronal excitation per se is the life force. It feels good. So organisms seek and obtain it. More excitation feels even better. And intense excitation, such as occurs during orgasm, feels intensely good. However, at levels beyond such intensity of excitation, the excitation becomes aversive and is perceived as pain. How does pleasure system differ from the pain system? At a basic level, the pleasure system can be characterized as the do again what you just did system, whereas the pain system can be characterized as the don't do that again system. As James Olds showed, when his rats pressed the lever and received electrical stimulation near the nucleus accumbens, they pressed the lever again. Was it pleasure, or were they only compelled to do over again what they just did? Evolutionarily, if a behavior pattern leads to a beneficial or non-aversive consequence, it is adaptive to repeat it. So the repeat what you just did system is evidently the reinforcement system, which strengthens or reinforces the connectivity of the neural pathway that produced the movement that it just performed. And we interpret this activity to be rewarding. It is likely that the neural system that generates this repetition or reinforcement of a motor performance incorporates the nucleus accumbens as a key component of the basal ganglia system, in which a series of components is activated in sequence, forming a recurrent loop that keeps reactivating itself. The loop includes the nucleus accumbens to the caudate, putamen, globus pallidus, thalamus, cortex, back to the nucleus accumbens, out to the motor system, and then around again. Thus, the action is reinforced, interpreted as reward, and extrapolates in humans to pleasure. It is the antithesis of a don't do that again system, which I suggest extrapolates to pain. A major driver of the nucleus accumbens is dopamine, and a salient feature of orgasm is activation of the dopaminergic system. Neurons of the ventral tegmentum release dopamine at the nucleus accumbens. Dopaminergic drugs such as bupropion potentiate sexual response and orgasm, while dopaminergic antagonists such as haloperidol inhibit sexual response and orgasm. Drugs that increase dopamine levels by facilitating their release and/or blocking their reuptake, especially cocaine, are reported to produce both a euphoria of pleasurable sensations and also a craving. Breiter and Stein studied cocaine-induced euphoria and craving. They emphasized that the brain regions activated during euphoria were different from the brain regions activated during craving. However, we found that during orgasm, all of those brain regions were activated. That is, they reported that the insula, caudate, and substantia nigra were activated during euphoria, whereas the amygdala, anterior cingulate, and orbitofrontal cortex were activated during craving. But we found in our functional MRI studies of orgasm that during orgasm, all these brain regions were activated, in addition to the nucleus accumbens. Thus, at orgasm, since the brain components that generate euphoria are activated concurrently with those producing craving, perhaps the combination generates the unique quality of erotic sensuality. Perhaps the quality of erotic sensuality is not only the simultaneous craving for genital stimulation, but also the euphoric feeling of getting the genital stimulation that is being craved, with both occurring simultaneously. Berridge and Kringleback use different terminology, which basically means the same thing. They use the terms wanting and liking. It is certainly a uniquely intense experience if you get what you crave while still craving it. Or in other terms, if you get what you want and like it while still wanting it. I suggest that orgasm has these qualities at high intensity, which makes it especially erotically pleasurable. The importance of sensory stimulation-produced neuronal excitation can be extrapolated to complex behavior, as exemplified in two quotes, one by Charles Kaufman, who stated, "Most gratifications are derived from stimulation, not the lack of it." And Sigmund Freud stated, "The child sought nursing again for the pleasurable state it produced, which it should be noted is a state of stimulation." Proprioception generated by muscular activity provides us a primary source of sensory stimulation. Glickman and Schiff proposed that the feeling of muscular contraction per se, as in motor behavior, is reinforcing in and of itself. And by extension to humans, it feels good. Our muscular activity generates proprioceptive stimulation, and that feels pleasurable. Genital orgasm involves excitation, including proprioceptive excitation, that builds to a crescendo and triggers a high threshold opponent process of active inhibition, which leads to a resolution or calming of the original excitation. I think it is important to recognize that this crescendo process is not restricted to the genital system. The crescendo of excitation occurs in a sneeze, a yawn, a stretch, and at lower intensity, more subtle processes such as swallowing. I suggest that these can be considered examples of non-genital orgasms. Thus, I suggest that there is an orgasmic process that is common to multiple normal, hardwired behavioral responses, of which genital orgasm can be considered a special case. Why do I emphasize the importance of neuronal excitation per se? Euphoria is a state of intense neuronal excitation. Pleasure is a state of neuronal excitation. At the most primitive level, neuronal excitation is essential to neuronal viability. Without excitation, neurons die. Thus, organisms, including ourselves, are designed to seek and obtain neuronal excitation through obtaining sensory stimulation as a primary means of generating neuronal excitation. It is essential to the survival of the nervous system and the organism. This principle is demonstrated by the phenomenon of Wallerian degeneration. If a sensory nerve pathway is severed, Wallerian degeneration occurs, in which a sequential chain of neurons that are connected synaptically dies due to the lack of synaptic input from the first neuron in the sequential chain. Wiesel and Hubel found that when they blindfolded one eye in kittens, this blockage of visual input produced a marked atrophy of neurons in the lateral geniculate nucleus, which is the visual relay site in the thalamus. In humans, Ramachandran demonstrated that after a hand amputation, there was neuronal degeneration of the entire afferent pathway to the cortex. That is, as a result of the absence of sensory input from the hand, the normal three-chain neural pathway spanning two synaptic levels all the way up to the sensory cortex died out. These two studies demonstrate that synaptic input resulting from neuronal excitation is a requirement for neuronal survival and function. Summarizing these considerations, absence of neuronal excitation is detrimental to the nervous system and hence the organism, whereas neuronal excitation feels good and is beneficial, an effect essential to the life of the organism. If we perceive a lack of stimulation from our environment, we seek to obtain it for ourselves in one way or another. As an extreme case, under conditions of severe sensory deprivation, our brain generates neuronal excitation in the form of hallucinations, as shown by Mason and Brady. As a striking form of seeking stimulation, I recall a speaker at a seminar looking terrified, and then as he started to speak, he held his hand pressed against his chest with what looked like all his strength. He never released his pressing hand for his entire hour-long presentation. It looked as if he was giving himself a continuous hug, physical stimulation to overcome fear of rejection, or worse, abandonment by us, his audience. Erich Fromm considered anxiety to be the apprehension of isolation in some form, such as separation, abandonment, or ostracism. In its most primitive form, that is, earliest in our development, physical contact with mother or other caretaker provides us with comforting sensory stimulation. Then as we mature, symbolic social stimulation can substitute for that physical stimulation. For example, a text message or a phone call from a loved one. If that strategy is unsatisfying, we may try to compensate for it with a substitute, such as smoking, eating, or drinking, which generates internal visceral stimulation. Visceral afferent activity converges on the same spinal cord neurons as somatic afferent activity at the same dermatomal level, as in the case of referred pain. Thus, the visceral sensation generated by smoking, eating, or drinking could serve as a substitute for the somatic stimulation of thoracic or abdominal stimulation, such as a hug or its symbolic contact equivalent. A colleague described that the moment that any minor disappointment or a mistake or some form of rejection occurred, it immediately triggered a craving for a cigarette. He said the smoke filled his lungs with stimulation. It was reassuring. But what if such social, somatic, or visceral strategies fail, or if they're unsatisfying? Perhaps then our body does its best to provide the stimulation for us. Asthmatic attacks are reported to often be triggered by actual or threatened abandonment or loss of a loved one. The lung congestion provides respiratory resistance, a potent sensory stimulus. Experimentally, increasing blood pressure by various means induces sleep-like activity in the brain and even actual sleep, and it attenuates pain. Thus, hypertension may actually be our body's attempt to provide us with visceral stimulation that calms us down. What if we don't pay attention to those attempts by our body to give us the stimulation that we crave? I suggest that then our body increases the intensity of those stimuli. People who are alexithymic, literally without words for feelings, typically have associated psychosomatic diseases, such as gastrointestinal problems or chronic hypertension. It is as if when they don't pay attention to their body's signals, the signals grow stronger. They shout chronically via increasing activity of the organ generating the sensory stimulation to the point of organic pathology. Thus, in this formulation, neural excitation stimulation is essential. We crave it, we seek it, it is pleasurable, it is beneficial. If we lack it or can't or don't get it, we generate it somehow, externally, somatically, or internally, viscerally. And if all those strategies fail, our body gives it to us as best it can, but its effort can become pathological through chronic hyperactivity if we don't respond to it. But not all neural excitation feels good. What's different about neuronal excitation that feels bad? From the perspective of neuronal excitation, what is pain? I suggest that the difference between pleasurable stimulation and painful stimulation is the relative intensity of the excitation and the contribution of neuronal inhibition neuronal inhibition is as crucial to normal neural processes as is neuronal excitation. It is estimated that 40% of the synapses in the human brain are inhibitory, utilizing GABA as the neurotransmitter. Without neuronal inhibition, our movements would be spastic. Neuronal inhibition enables us to move gracefully and with precision. At a biologically primitive level, we have hardwired inhibitory neuronal systems that enable coordinated behavior that's evolutionarily adaptive. Inhibitory neurons are protectively hardwired to antagonistic muscles, even at the level of spinal reflexes, so that when the flexors are activated, the extensors are actively inhibited, and vice versa. More complex, higher levels of neural organization in the brain utilize the same principle of hardwired active excitation coupled with active inhibition. Thus, painful stimulation activates a pain inhibitory system endogenously that attenuates the pain and at extremely intense levels produces actual blackout, unconsciousness. Similarly, pleasurable stimulation also excites an active inhibitory system. The intense excitation at women's orgasm excites a potential pain inhibitory system, a potent pain inhibitory system. In this study with Beverly Whipple, we found that vaginal self-stimulation increased pain thresholds by 50%. Pleasurable vaginal self-stimulation increased the pain threshold by 75%. And vaginal self-stimulation orgasm increased the pain threshold by over 100%. In men at orgasm, the activated inhibitory system produces the, quote, refractory period, during which we found with Kashina Allen that sensory responses to genital penile self-stimulation were markedly inhibited. Thus, the intense pleasurable excitation at orgasm turns on intense inhibition, but the intense excitation produced by pain is different. I suggest that the critical difference between pleasure and pain is that the inhibition that they both trigger is surpassed in the case of pain, but not in the case of pleasure. In other words, pain elicits an intensity of activation that surpasses the capacity of the inhibitory system that it activates to sufficiently control and attenuate it. Thus, the intensity is beyond inhibitory control, and we perceive it as aversive, as painful. I suggest that a metaphor for this is an ocean wave. The wave concentrates energy and builds to a crescendo, the peak of which is orgasm. Beyond the inhibitory threshold of the surface tension of the water, the wave breaks, representing pain. Of course, there are myriad factors, including cognitive factors, involved in setting the threshold at which sensory stimuli are perceived as painfully aversive, such as entering a hot bath, consuming chili peppers, experiencing BDSM. But they probably all depend on the extent to which the activation of our inhibitory system is sufficiently intense to control the perceived excitation intensity. But once the stimulation intensity is beyond the control of the inhibitory system, we perceive the stimulation as painful. Thus, to summarize, we seek stimulation, excitation, we work to generate it. It asserts our existence. Our neurons require it for their existence and survival. It perpetuates itself, reactivating the system that just produced it, hence reinforcing the activity of that system. It feels good because it feels, and it does not feel bad. It does not produce inhibition that turns it off or prevents it from recurring. An alternative is no excitation, but our nervous system abhors inactivity, abhors no excitation. In the absence of neuronal activity, we crave it, are biologically compelled to obtain it, or we voluntarily generate it, or our body generates it for us, which if ignored in chronic may produce psychosomatic pathology. Neuronal excitation activates its own inhibition by inborn hardwired mechanisms. The intense excitation can feel euphoric, orgasmic. At higher intensities, to the extent that we perceive the inhibition as insufficient to attenuate the excitation, we perceive it as painful and aversive. In conclusion, I have endeavored to synthesize the qualities of pleasure and pain in terms of the unitary principle that all neuronal activity is in the form of action potentials, which either excite or inhibit other neurons' action potentials. We must remember that neurons are just bags of chemicals, and action potentials is all they do. Ultimately, the phenomena of pleasure and pain need to be accounted for by this blatant, simple reality. But this is all that our neurons and we have to work with. That is all our brain is made of. I welcome your critical thoughts on other ways to account for pleasure and pain in terms of what is known about what neurons are capable of. Thank you for your attention.
Barry and Nan, thank you for joining me for further conversation. Basically, I decided to organize this symposium because I thought we need to think a little bit more deeply about the nature of experience on mechanistic and evolutionary levels, and you two came to mind, so let's go.
Thanks
want to
for
talk about?
having us, Adam. Thank you
Adam.
so much.
Thank
Yeah.
you for the invitation. It's really interesting topics.
So, so we have pain, pleasure. We have the nature of affects and their evolutionary origins, and like just questions that we, I guess, beg. Like we talk about pain, we talk about pleasure as if we know what we're talking about. We talk about emotions as if like it's like, well, which emotions and why? So, do you want to start with like pleasure and pain, core affect?
And I think when people are not in connection with their own nervous systems and core emotions, and they're not connected with other people, they're much more likely to be in the defensive states that really get in the way of the connection and of the proper functioning of these core systems. And this is what I see hijacked. You know, I look at this a lot as a clinician every day, trying to figure out how to help people promote their abilities to be caring of each other, of having playfulness, to have access to the lust system, and the downregulating of the defenses, which really is like an overactivation of the sympathetic system. So it's really about, you know, how I imagine that when we feel safe, and Adam, you said something in your presentation about the dual nature of attention, that it's easier to get attention to something when you're in that entrainment, and then that actually promotes, the attention promotes the entrainment. So it's like that ability, you know, it's all about, and the attention stuff is so hijacked by our visceral emotions, because when you're in pain or when you're anxious or when you have a lot of fear or whatever, that's where your attention goes, to what feels bad. Pain really
that's where
and a lot of people live in their pain bodies. You know the concept of the pain body? Just
so that's a frozen metaphor. It's and that's not healthy. But I just want to get back to the idea of the entrainment. You know, there are certain functions of the entrainment, like in the case of orgasm, genital stimulation, you start the repetitive stimulation produces recruitment of neurons that gets synchronized, and the synchrony, the entrainment and the synchrony results in being in ejaculation. In the case of sexual stimulation, it results in ejaculation, which requires the activation of the sympathetic system to produce the ejaculation. And that's a high threshold system. It's not active all the time. We don't walk around ejaculating. So in that context,
for yourself, I'm teasing you.
in that context, the rhythmical stimulation of sexual stimulation, the rhythmical genital stimulation, produces an entrainment, recruitment of many different systems, which the building of the excitement enables the activation of this normally high threshold system, the ejaculation system. And then, so in that context, that amount of entrainment and synchrony and recruitment is has a function. It has the function of producing ejaculation. If it goes too far, an extreme situation of that is a seizure, where everything gets synchronized. That's abnormal. So there's a certain level, optimal level, biologically optimal level of different functions where a certain degree of entrainment is optimal, but then it could become pathological.
So to what degree are all, both like the mechanism itself of like this, like pleasure and pain as part of like the signal for tuning yourself to optimal entrainment?
Pleasure is do again what you just did.
Do more, get more of it, and then pain, stop, like let the attractor dissolve. I'm wondering whether like all the
stop.
Whether all like the core affects potentially like have this set up, even like the ones that seem like they would like be like sticky attractors, like panic. But there's a sense like if you go into it and if you don't panic about panic, there would be this kind of self-regulating quality to it that would just like, by letting it be there, tuning in, just all the evolved affects would just have to be set up with this kind of like opponency balancing, like and like so you're like, but you don't think this. You think like no, the panic's here. It's the worst thing possible. And then you have like meta panic. But actually, if you just go into it, the pain body kind of,
by going into it, it will elicit its own inhibition. And
maybe I hope so.
Well,
another way,
we're evolutionarily, we're adapted to do that because we have survived evolutionarily. So we have those systems that are hardwired, the self-regulating systems, and it's just a question of responding to them. So I mean, what your idea of tuning in, yeah, if you tune into it, then there will the panic won't get out of control. If you're tuned into the panic response, then it will enable its own control mechanisms. Because if we didn't have those internal, if we didn't evolutionarily develop those internal mechanisms of the self-preserving mechanisms, we wouldn't be here. So
trust what you're saying intellectually. It doesn't feel that way though.
I know, because we ignore, to the extent that we ignore them or don't respond to them or not responsive to them because of social pressure, cultural pressures, that we screw ourselves. But if we just depend on our evolutionary imperative, our biological, we have evolved. We have evolved and survived. We have survival mechanisms that we embody. We are built that way. It's taken a long time, but here we are. So we have all those self-protective mechanisms. We can ignore them, and that's when we run into trouble. But if I think some of the drug therapy, the psychoactive drug therapy, facilitates our ability to respond to the visceral sensations, the visceral signals.
Hallucinogenics that you're talking about, because
What?
You said psychoactive. You mean the hallucinogens that?
Yeah. Using those in therapy, it makes the individual aware of the visceral sensations.
5-HT2A is heavily expressed on the anterior insula, so that could potentially contribute.
That's right.
I want to talk about panic because that's a great example. The panic activation, people who are predisposed to maybe panic attacks. It actually is like the learning levels where you panic about the panic because you've had experiences that were aversive as a result of your panic experiences that predispose you to panic about the panic and get inflamed more inflamed as a result of that. So you're absolutely right. The treatment of a lot of these things is to learn to be present to the sensations in the body. The thoughts in the mind, you can learn to loosen and soften, and your interpretations of what the panic means, So I, with my panic disorder, learned to be able to have the sensations in my body and not to panic about the panic.
So in other words, in my case of where I was waiting to hear about the outcome of my grant application, and I was running in my mind, it was like a dream image, running away as far as I could get, as fast as I could get there. If I recognized that my autonomic system is doing the running away because of this situation, then I wouldn't panic. I mean, I'd understand why is my heart beating? Why do I have this tachycardia all of a sudden? It's because I'm running away because I don't want to face the outcome, the results. I don't want to hear, that I didn't get it. So
I'm going to use that. That's like a really good framing, because it's like, it both gives you like some distance and like a little bit of self-compassion too, because it's like, this is, thank you, panic system, for giving me some of this experience. And like, no, this isn't like you're bad because you're experiencing. No, that's part of it. There's a challenge. That's what happens.
The child in me is doing something very logical, which is getting the hell out of here. Here's danger. Here's potential danger. I mean, I'm framing it as it's a cognitive concept that, of rejection, of failure. That's very highly cognitive. But my child in me is getting the hell out of here because it's a dangerous situation. And my autonomic system is doing that. If I just realize that, then that's the explanation of why is my heart racing. It's because I'm running away.
I like this a lot better than harshly judging myself for my suffering, which works great.
No, exactly.
It works every time.
Overrated, Anna. I mean, I've made a career out of teaching people what I've needed to know. And, I went on the Today Show and was able to have a good time and be relaxed because I've learned how to work with my autonomic nervous system and how to get into that place, a lot of just training my body to like get into that place of being in that more relaxed tone.
So I think those drugs, I think the hallucinogenic drugs and the psychoactive drugs facilitate that ability to know your visceral sensations.
What do they mean? 20 years maybe if I did that instead of 20 years of yoga and psychotherapy.
Right. Here are my gut sensations. What are they telling me? They're telling me I want to hit somebody because I'm angry, or they're telling me that I'm that I want to run away. That's what my body is. That's what my autonomic system is doing. It's maintaining my physical plant doing what is best for me at that moment. And if I just understand what is it telling me, that in itself tells me why am I feeling this way.
So that's the information. I always say that activation of our core affects gives us information, but there's also can be inflammation, as I like to say, because when we've had a lot of experiences, a lot of learning, a lot of conditioned boo-boos around something, for example, then when that affect is triggered in a situation, it's not just that situation, it's all the remembered. And when I say remembered, I'm talking about, like it doesn't necessarily have to be conscious remembering. It can be conditioning that actually inflames you and your system, where you can really have a hijacking, because it's not really about just that present thing. So I think what we're really defining here in a way is how trauma, stored experience, can inflame you in those core affects where where the information gets lost in the inflammation. It's not about the present time.
I remember one time when I was a kid, my teacher in junior high school insulted me for something. I don't remember why. She insulted me for something. And I told my mother about it when I got home. I said, I'm really angry at her. And my mother said, you shouldn't be angry at an adult. She's your teacher. You shouldn't be angry at her. So now that's a very mild trauma. But here is a normal. I mean, she could have said, I can appreciate why you're angry. Just don't tell her that. Don't hit her or something. That would be a different way of dealing. But to what am I supposed to do if I feel angry, but I'm not supposed to feel angry? That creates a problem. So
20 years later, you're in therapy with all sorts of difficulties listening to the information of the rage system.
So if your social
and taking appropriate stance.
Right. If your social environment affirms the validity of your feeling at the time, you say, yeah, well, that's a natural reaction, but just don't express it. That would be a way of dealing with it. But if you say, that's the wrong sensation, that's the wrong feeling, you shouldn't be angry, that screws you up. So that's the idea of congruency and anyway.
You're both going to like fragment your mind in terms of like, you're going to lose the information, but also like you'll get into these reactive, like generalized inflammatory loops of like, you'll be angry that you're angry because like you shouldn't be angry.
That's right. You shouldn't.
And then like, but then
you get angry because you're angry.
You'll get angrier. And but like, and you'll probably actually get also inflammation in like the body itself.
Yeah,
so it's like it's system is inflamed.
That's what I mean by the incongruence. If you can just express it and acknowledge it and recognize it for what it is, that resolves it. That's it.
I trust what you're saying. I will try to practice that.
So will I. Easier said than done.
God.
Where are we? Oh, it's more than four. It's more than.
Okay, so I guess. Yeah, well, we will. I guess.
Okay.
So I guess we could like. Okay, so.
11:55.
Let's just like say something to like sign off the recording and let Nan get to her meeting, and then like I guess I'll send it around, and we'll like identify clips that we particularly like, and I think the whole conversation would be good for that to be online, because I mean I really liked it, and I think people could benefit from it, and so in terms of for the conference, like a curated section, and I think maybe the whole thing for YouTube.
Sure.
Okay.
Great dialogue. I'd like to say in closing that we need to pay attention to our bodies, remember that we have them, and we need to focus on each other rather than our devices for these emotional systems to work properly.
And I would say that we should appreciate our bodies, appreciate what our bodies are, our bodily reactions to situations. Our body is trying to help us. Our body is doing. We've evolved to be healthy and to live. So and our bodily systems are organized to enable us to do that. So the best thing is for us to be aware of what our body is telling us, and try as much as possible to respond accordingly. And that will be physical and mental health.
Well said, Barry. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you for organizing the whole symposium.
Thank you.
And that's my dog, Jilly, hearing something that she perceives as her job to go bark at. So I'll sign off, guys.
Okay.
Take good care.
Take
Bye.
care. Bye. Bye, Nan. Bye, Adam.